very closely connected, hard to separate in terms of technology, at least with weapons. The key dates again 1944 TIFR starts, and another key date is 1949 when China goes communist. Nehru, is this thing that he's not aware of the Chinese threat, which is I think completely rubbish. He was fully aware. I don't think he did much about it. I don't think he could have done much about it. And nuclear weapons were certainly not the answer in those days. But the point was, it was a marker. That was because that certainly changes his attitude about the peace rhetoric of nuclear technology. Until then, he used to say, nuclear weapons, peace. He had the usual mantra. But after that, he had these statements where he said, I don't know how you can separate peaceful use and military use. This technology can be used for both, so I don't know what that means. It becomes a little more ambiguous, so it's very hard to know why. But the fact that this change happens around this time. But I mean, at this point, I do not think you can argue that Nehru was thinking about the bomb, but he never wanted to close India's options. I think that was very clear. In 1956, you have Apsara, and 1960, you have CESS. And in 1962, which is the big marker, is the war. Yeah.
Who was guiding Nehru at that time? Was it directly Baba or
Homi Baba? Homi Baba and Nehru, you see their letters, they say dear Bhai, that's how they used to talk. So they were very close. They would, they were personal friends.
Figure out if Baba was guiding Nehru, why did Nehru have so much of ambiguity in his life?
No, Baba was not as much of a weapons freak as you think he was. In the mid-50s, as a case I interviewed for my research, he told me there was he gave me a source. He said there was a letter which Baba writes to Nehru saying, look, in the UN, he's speaking in the UN, some meeting. He says, we are talking about universal disarmament and all these things, and here's, if we sign this treaty, this is how we can push it, and this is like a great way of getting your agenda through. So Nehru says, why don't you leave the politics of this to me? You just go and give the speech I told you. So in that sense, I think that is for me the clear indicator that Nehru was not as clueless about these things. He might have been clueless about other things, but this is fully aware of what the significance was of losing the option. Doesn't mean he will go and say, okay, make a bomb. It only means that he was aware that he had that option, and keeping the option open was important, because it also served as a bargaining chip. You will always go to the West and say, look, I have this option. If you are going to mistreat me, I might be forced to go for it. And that could, get you more military aid and that sort of stuff.
How much was Baba had this huge network of friends among the nuclear community, right? Actually, so was it also the lack of enthusiasm for the weapon program was because he didn't want to be ostracized in the nuclear academic community and all that stuff?
I have not looked up Baba really as much. But with Baba, the thing is he had a lot of people who were, the West was fully aware of, Baba's connections also, and they would all be happy to tell him how, nuclear weapons are really not the answer for India's problems. So he got these lectures all the time, and so he ignored it, and they ignored it, and he said, okay, that's fine, let's talk about this reactor design and all. They talked business most of the time. There are very few people who outright said India should get the bomb. There are some French generals, I forget their names, there are one paper, especially in 1960 or so, a French field marshal says one time, what is India waiting for? They need a bomb, don't they realize? Because this is the time when the border disputes have already started, they're coming to the newspaper also, said China is not going to stop at just talking, they need the bombs, don't they realize this? So that support for the Indian nuclear program you see from very few countries. France is perhaps the only one. The Soviets kept quiet. My understanding from looking at their internal documents, what I have seen is that they were not ecstatic, but they were very pleased. They didn't really, because they knew full well that it will only, it was meant against China, and so they had nothing to worry about because China was bothering them so much. Anyway, then 62, the war comes. When the war comes, a lot of things change. The first thing after the war is a lot of money pushed into the CSIRs in India. And a lot of these questions are, how can these guys improve science and technology and help defense? That and help defense becomes very important because India is very interested in getting CSIR to do a lot more of these dual use things. You can make a nice chip, that's very good. You can make a toaster with it, but can you also make a missile with it? That's the sort of questions people start asking. Exactly, a lot of focus is there. Not that it means much, I'll explain why later, but that focus is there. India suddenly develops, understands the idea that it needs to start thinking a little more strategically.
Would that coincide with China actually?
On hand.
War.
Oh, war.
Right.
And would that coincide with China actually testing the bomb in Asia first?
64.
16th October, right?
Yeah.
So means India was almost prepared for the for testing bomb till then, right?
No, India was not rich. The Chinese tested in 64. No?
Chinese question.
When did China actually start working on this? I mean,
China
they had
worked
civil
on-
war and everything.
Right.
By
The moment they came to power, they knew full well they needed nuclear weapons. Chinese, I'm sure Mao might have known even in 45, I don't know, but I know for a fact from 49 they were very much on. There's very little written on China in the West. China builds the bomb is the best book I can recommend. Shu Dai and John Lewis, I think. China builds the bomb. I have on my blog there's a reading list called The Nuclear Age. You have all the country specific and general theoretical lists there if you want.
But kind of situation China was in, I mean, was it possible for them to build it, on their
The
own?
Russian, Soviets had done a lot. In 1958, the Soviets called back the engineers, but by then they had taken China up to the door, and it was, not that difficult to go from that point to the next. The problem was China had rushed the bomb; they didn't have the infrastructure for it, and so that took time. The Chinese nuclear scientists, normally what happens is in the Soviet Union and all these things, to treat the people who serve the state very nicely, you give them a nice house and say, go make wonders. In China, it was so bad a condition that even the nuclear scientists, their wives would have to go out and forage, literally on trees and stuff for fruits and stuff because it was simply not available. That is how bad it was. They literally tightened their belts to make that bomb. It was that difficult. And that is the thing which the Chinese can get away with. Other countries would hesitate. So, anyway, that is the Indians. After the 62 war, they understand this. In 64, in 63, there was a limited test ban treaty. The limited test ban treaty was something that the Irish, the Nehru, sort of not co-authored, I suppose, but the idea was very close. The idea was it was a step towards non-proliferation, basically. And the idea behind that was simply that Nehru felt that if China can be stopped from testing, they sign this treaty, then perhaps we have an advantage. But the non-proliferation idea didn't kick in. It became limited test ban. So he said, let's make it more difficult. You have to have 150 feet below the ground, X, Y, Z. Because that changes a lot of dynamics. Because 150 feet below the ground, when you're testing it, you can set it with a remote control device, which is not how it works when you drop it from a plane. Because then the triggers for the bombs will be different. You might have a barometer for the pressure, and at certain pressure you can detonate it. So the height, altitude, all these things are changing. You will not be able to conduct studies on atmospheric test, meaning you will not know the difference between testing the bomb at 4,000 feet versus like detonation at 4,000 feet versus ground level in terms of the difference between a ground burst versus a detonation at 4,000 feet. What is the radioactive spread? How much damage can be done? All these sort of technical aspects the military would know. All these reasons the LTBT had some merit to it. China didn't sign it, so that was problem one. And Nehru died before the Chinese tested the bomb, obviously, but China tested it in 64, which again created panic. Now, if you look at the documents here, you will notice that there's a lot of fear of the Chinese in 1960, well, obviously 62, 63, but it sort of peters out slowly by about 65, 66. And the reason is, I think, once the panic went down, that we're all going to speak Chinese now. Once they retreated, they gave back Arunachal for all intents and purposes. The strategists said, the Chinese can't actually have a full-scale war against India, in the sense that the Himalaya would be so difficult that their supply lines would be really fragile. If they try that, it is so easy to disrupt their supply lines. It is, yes, they can do it with modern aircraft X, Y, Z, but try supplying an army of, say, 200,000 men across the Himalaya. guerrilla fighters can take apart those lines, and therefore a full-scale invasion, as we thought was possible, is not going to be possible. So you don't have to worry about the annexation of India. What happened to Tibet will not happen to India, basically. And that might be part of the reason why the Indians slightly backed off from the antagonizing or using China as the excuse every single time. But they still said, when they asked for the nuclear umbrella, Shastri asked for the nuclear umbrella, they were very clear. We want a nuclear umbrella, and they said we want it from all the nuclear powers, like the US, the Soviets, the British, and even the French if they want to do. They left out China specifically because a nuclear umbrella from China meant nothing. They wanted the umbrella from the other powers against China. I think that's pretty clear, but the latest state of research in academia, at least in the West, is that the Indian bomb was about prestige and not about security concerns. I find that absolutely. I think they underestimate the financial issues, they underestimate the moral issues, and they underestimate the ineptitude also, to a certain extent, of the Indian government. I really don't think, but despite the ineptitude, I don't think anybody, you talk to your parents, anybody, that 62 generation, many of them will have a visceral hate. My dad, for example, has a visceral hatred of the Chinese, to this day. And it is so obvious anywhere you go, that when I interviewed people for my dissertation, most of them told me, hey, why are you doing all this obvious stuff? You should do this, and they'll give me they'll suggest other topics for the dissertation. 47 to 74, we know exactly what happened. We're scared of China, we wanted a bomb. Okay, maybe we're a little slow, but that is how obvious it is to a lot of Indians at least, the older Indians at least. Anyway, in 66, Shastri authorizes the subterranean nuclear explosion project, and a lot of, the Indians like to talk about this peaceful nuclear explosion, a subterranean nuclear explosion, a project, it's not a bomb, but explosion is an explosion. I don't think, in that sense, I do see this as a step closer towards the bomb. But it's a small increment again. They want to keep the option open. Shastri, for all the, village fellow he was a very smart guy in my opinion. Not much has been, he has not been studied. I think he deserves more attention, honestly, scholarly attention. And he understood the advantage of keeping it open, keeping the option open, getting cooperation from the West. Particularly when, during his prime ministership, there was another war with Pakistan in 65. There was a famine and there was a devaluation of the currency. Three major issues. Not to mention domestic tension. We have the South wanting to secede and the Hindi riots and all these things. And so with all this on his plate, nuclear weapons were not exactly, unless China was attacking tomorrow, he didn't want to talk about nuclear weapons. So he told Baba, fine, go ahead, he authorized, and that was it. In 68, the NPT happened, and this is one very puzzling thing where I say that I think the receding fear of China mattered. Indira Gandhi, rumors have almost signed the NPT, but ultimately she decided no. The reason she almost went is because a lot of her strategists told her, listen, there's no way they'll have a full-on invasion, and so on. And they had all these reasons. So if China really, if you find Chinese forces in the middle of Madhya Pradesh, I'm sure the Soviets would do something at that point. So all these reasons were given, and she sort of bought into it, and she understood the futility of nuclear weapons in the sense that it is still too expensive for the Indians to afford. 74 was not a booming economy. Unless you're a dictatorship who didn't care about people. Look at the other countries who had nuclear weapons. The British, the French, and the US. Rich countries, they had NATO to support them, they had the Marshall Plan to support them initially. First world countries, which meant, because in 1947, for example, French literacy, yes, the war was shattered, but French literacy was in the 90s. In 1947, India's literacy, the highest estimate I've seen is 12%. So that building that infrastructure takes time. So although we can gripe about the slow progress of Indian nuclear weapons, we must also, or nuclear energy, we must also conceive that we've really started almost from the cave days and moved rapidly forward, and in that sense there is some merit to the achievements that have been done. What changes, I think, ultimately is 71. There was a war in which the Chinese and the Americans seemed to work together. And the Soviets are not entirely, they side with the Indians in the sense that they also send in a submarine to tail the USS Enterprise in the Bay of Bengal. But they don't come out overtly and say, okay, here are 100 missiles, here you can have them in case China attacks. And India realizes, Indira Gandhi realizes that the equation has shifted. Until now, she said, okay, if China invades, in the 50s, which was very, India was pretty clear, if China invades, the US would definitely support us and probably the Soviets. In 62, that is exactly what happens. The Americans, Russian troops, and Jawaharlal Nehru actually asked for 12 squadrons of American Air Force jets flown by American pilots. And so non-alignment is a very complicated word. It's not as simple as it sounds. Yeah.
Why did they only want to send the NPT?
Because by 68, China fear had receded to the strategist had told us. She didn't want to sign it, but she had definitely flirted with signing it. And I suspect it is because the fear of China had receded, because people had explained to her that full-scale Chinese invasion that we were thinking of is very, very difficult, almost impossible.
Then why did she not do it?
What?
Sign the NPT.
Sign the NPT. Because ultimately this is the ultimate insurance, no? But see, what changes ultimately is this, that you can sign later also. I suppose maybe she was thinking about, maybe she wasn't, but the point is, within 2-3 years, the environment changes completely. From a point when she could be fairly sure that the Americans would help, like 67, 68, the Americans hate the Chinese, all is good in India's worldview. In 71, what happens is Kissinger goes flights to China. And in early 70, the war happens and she sees how the US, the Soviets and the Chinese are positioned. In 72, Nixon himself goes to China, so clearly those talks have succeeded. And the order to test is given after the talks. She waits for a couple of months to think about this. There are I have 2 sets of documents. One says the order was given in April, 2 months after the Nixon visit to China. The other says August, but both are very clear it was 1972 the order was given.
After Bangladesh was fully done.
Yeah, Bangladesh was fully done.
Does the non thing have a bearing on NPT?
Non-alignment was.
It's a top shot.
It is, yes, I think it is the sheer numbers game.
Those days, I think Gandhi family had a lot of, as you said, they preferred more of an ideological thing to be highlighted rather than thinking in depth on national security.
See,
Somewhere I get that feeling.
Honestly, with Nehru, I think that is true. The ideology matters. Indira Gandhi, the only ideology, in my opinion, was power.
Yeah.
I absolutely do not think that woman. Intellectually, you might sit there and talk to her about philosophy. That's a different issue. But when it comes to running a country, I think her only ideology was power. The way, that's a different talk. But the point is,
I just wanted to get this. If Nam thing was having a bearing on NPT, I was kind of confused with their policies.
Not on NPT directly, but in a very roundabout way perhaps, because the NPT is a very complex issue. See, the NPT, the message is, the idea is, the image is given that it is about non-proliferation, it's about peace. Nonsense, absolute nonsense. The US wanted the NPT because they don't want China to have the bomb.
Basically, it was like haves and have-nots. You have
Exactly.
and you
want
don't
to
have.
create, you want to defend the
Which
status.
is why India was like.
The Soviets were in the NPT because they don't want the Germans to make the bomb. The British and the French wanted the NPT because they wanted to make sure that their interests were protected.
Even the date of you being liable for NPT, January 1st, 67
Right.
and before, isn't it?
Right. And the Italians, the Germans, West Germans and the Indians were in it because they don't want to lose their rights. And all these factors played in the making of the NPT. It had absolutely nothing to do with peace. And the clearest indication of this is after the NPT was ratified, after the signing ceremony was done, then the Americans say, oh, by the way, nuclear weapons sharing within NATO countries is not under NPT. I'm sorry, but if you believe in non-proliferation, how can you share nuclear weapons? How can you station, that is unacceptable. Which is why I think the idea of the NPT, which is why I have an issue with the whole non-proliferation regime, because it is a hoax. It might have some good intentions, there might be some genuine people who believe in genuine nuclear disarmament, but if they're going to quote NPT at me, that tarnishes their genuineness, in my opinion. So,
just a small question. Was there any known influence on Jawaharlal Nehru by KDK Menon and Patel discussions on nuclear thing?
the nuclear thing.
So Patel was a strong man and Menon had.
Right. See, first of all, the problem is the sources. The documents I have read, the selected papers of Jawaharlal Nehru, the second series, will give you, I think right now they have hit about 1958, 1960. There's some 40, 45 volumes released. And in those volumes and in the Nehru Memorial Library, I have not seen any discussions. I'm not saying that it is impossible, but I have not seen any documents. I have not seen anybody saying, sir, you talk to Menon about this. That also I have not seen. But given Menon's positions, I can, if they had a talk, I can guess what he might have said. But that is not proof. That is only conjecture. It might be intelligent conjecture, given we have pretty much a lot of his utterances.
So more classified documents.
Oh yeah, the Indians are absolutely atrocious at declassifying documents. Another talk, but still.
Dr. Bhava died in 10th class, right?
Yeah, 66.
And there was some conspiracy theory that it was an act by some foreign powers.
I've heard that, but it's difficult to substantiate that. So
Let's get back to this.
right. Anyway, then in 74, India tests. So that is the brief history of how we got to nuclear weapons status. Let me go to the third section, modern people, modern energy and modern weapons.
So between 62 and 71, 74 when we test, so when did our scientific establishment hit a point where if the politicians said test tomorrow, they could do it?
This is a very good question, and I think it's 1972. There are a lot of theories that India could have tested before the NPT, before 1960. I think it's nonsense. Most of the scientists I've talked to, they say that after an Indian visit to the Soviet reactor at Dubna, they created they had these, all these different research reactors. They had, Purnima and all these things, right? Zarlina, Zarlina was later, but the point is Purnima was there. And that allowed them to understand the plutonium chemistry, because the way the plutonium bomb, what India tested first was, is you'll have a plutonium core. A plutonium core, if it's solid, the weight of it is enough to have critical mass and just detonate on its own. So they make it hollow. And in the hollow, they put the neutron source, the trigger. Okay. Then what happens, when a bomb explodes, there's so much energy pushing the bomb out. So what happens is you have enough for a chain reaction for like a nanosecond or maybe 10 nanoseconds, and then all the materials is flown away. So what you want to do is try and keep it together as much as possible, which means you want to pack it with explosives, pushing the whole thing together. So instead of, to negate at least a little bit, even if 10 nanoseconds, 20 nanoseconds can delay that, there will be more chain reaction going on, so the fissile burn-up is higher. Another thing they do is they surround the plutonium with a tamper, which is usually an alloy, plutonium and something alloy, which will help the neutrons bounce back into the core again. As they're escaping, they'll bounce back in. Because these are very fast, neutrons, not slow neutrons. So it's hard to control them, so this is the tamper is required. All these things, the calculation to do it properly with a good burn-up, the reactor came in 72. Now, could they have done that visit earlier? Could they have built that reactor? Maybe, but it was not done. So I don't think they could have tested a working device before 72. Absolutely not. Anyway, the present. Now, in today's year,
Did Russia help us in making the bomb on that?
I have not seen any evidence. The Soviets were generous in other ways. There's a very interesting talk between DP, the Planning Commission fellow, and the Soviet field marshal, some very high up in the Ministry of Defense, their Ministry of Defense, in 1970. Actually, through 1969 to 1972, they had a series of meetings, and basically the Soviets tell the Indians that they will give the Indians 150 nuclear missiles, and they will station up to 1 million troops on the Soviet-China border. If the Indians would sign a clear, overt security pact with the Soviets. Now the question comes again, this is not so simple. Like, give meaning what? Give, or does that mean dual fingers? Like, because a lot of if you look at the American weapons in Germany, if you look at the American weapons in France, or in they used to be before 66 in France, or in the UK or Turkey and all this, or Italy, there's always two fingers in the button: the American finger, the Italian finger. So the Italians want to launch a nuke, they cannot until they have American permission also. Soviets might have had something similar to that with India. So, I would be very careful by, to see that as necessarily a wonderful, gift. But these talks were there, and the Soviets always say that the general rhetoric is that we want to be very careful. We appreciate that the Americans are finally woken up to the fact that our communist brothers, the Chinese, are not a threat. But that's just talk. They're very scared of the Sino-American, Sino-US rapprochement. And this is why the Indo-Soviet Treaty was done. The Indians had always pushed the Soviets away a little bit because the Soviets wanted to do with India what China is doing with Pakistan. Basically have a counterforce. The issue was the Indians never wanted to get that close to the Soviets. What pushed them over the edge? Okay. I mean, the Americans always point out to the Indo-Soviet Treaty and say that your non-alignment was not, really non-aligned. And the issue with that was 71. The way it shifted, the India said, okay, in this case we need to clearly evaluate where the center of that non-alignment is. It has shifted a little closer to the Soviet Union because you put so much weight on this side. So there is logic to this non-alignment, and non-alignment is not as spineless. It is spineless, but not as spineless as it is understood.
So the only foreign help we got was that can-do reactor.
Foreign help means every country in the world has received foreign help, including the Americans. The first people who made the bomb, the heavy water, the scientists, are all foreigners. A lot of these guys ran away from Europe and they worked there. The British had, because they got help from the Manhattan Project itself, the scientists working there. Plus, the Americans, although they cut them off in the actual giving of the bomb design type of thing, here are the scientists who worked on the bomb design. I think they can come home and replicate it, which is why they could do it so quickly. The French were a little more cut off from that, took a little longer. So, every country gets foreign help. We've also received foreign help in the sense that Apsara was a British reactor, our first research reactor. CANDU is a foreign, the CESS is a foreign reactor, fine. But that doesn't really make a program non-indigenous in any way.
What extent of the technology transfer as such will be goes there?
It's a very good question actually, and it is not very clear. But looking at the reactors in Rajasthan 3 and 4, for example, and other reactors, India's own CANDU. NPCL claims that they are better than the real CANDU, but that's not true. They're only up to 6th generation CANDU at best, if they can achieve that. CANDU has reached 9 or 10 generations at this point. The reactors that they made in imitation of the CANDU were not as good. They're not as good in the sense the power generation was not as much. The argument made was that the Indian power grids were very weak, and so we can't have a 1000 megawatt reactor, at least not in the mid 60s, early 70s, because that will just knock out, create problems in the grid. So we need more smaller reactors, which is what we call SMR, small modular reactors. So that is now becoming the fashion. This is what the Indians claim. I don't have the information to know how true that is, but it is an interesting point. It's definitely a technically valid point, and that I can definitely say.
Canada was highly pleased when India used CANDU reactor for
Yes.
nuclear.
Yes, because they felt the spirit was violated, whereas Indians and the letter was not. I think it's pretty clear from Canadian announcements that what they expected we can do, and I think it's pretty clear from what Indians said to them that good luck with that kind of hope. The Canadians are only deceiving themselves, and the reason for this is economics, honestly. There's a wonderful book called Politics of CANDU Exports, where they explain why Canada was in a rush to sell CANDU to India. Because they want, what happens is, if I sell you a nuclear reactor, basically you're my slave for 40 years. I will provide you the services, I will provide you the fuel, all these things. All these come in the contract, the secondary, tertiary clauses. So it's not so simple. My engineers will come help set it up in your country, all these things. And so basically I get business from you for 40 years, not just that one reactor. Now, if that reactor, basically if you buy a reactor from someone else, I am out of your market for 40 years. So it's a big deal. So the economics had to be trumped. And that happens in the US only after 1965 with the Gilpatrick report, where they talk about the nth country problem. Saying, this idea of getting markets for 40 years at a time might not be that good when you think about proliferation of nuclear weapons. Until 65 years, there was absolutely, not absolutely, there were people warning about it, but that it was not as big a deal.
Technology transfer also happened?
No, transfer didn't happen. I think we reverse engineered it, as far as I can tell. Because if it happened, then we must be very bad engineers that even after the transfer, we could give the reactors the identity.
It didn't happen.
Yeah, I don't think it happened.
No one will transfer technology.
Not for CANDU at least. CANDU is a very risky reactor proliferation, no matter what the company.
But was there any reason for Canada to pick this up? Because nobody would ever attack Canada.
Canada was very important in the American program. They had good supplies of uranium and all
it's made in USA with a stamp of Canada, that's what it is?
Made what Candu? No, Candu was a Canadian research reactor and everything. And selling that reactor to India would have kept the Canadian nuclear industry alive. Had that say not gone through, suppose the Indians said, we're going to go with the French design instead. Canadian nuclear industry would have closed very soon. I mean, that would have created real problems.
Yeah, that's why I asked. They didn't have any wars or anything.
They didn't have any wars. For them it was business.
Not only that, there's a political angle because you said that had the French gotten in, there were a couple of French generals you mentioned who were out and out for India to weaponize, right? So then that will become a political factor as well as an economic factor, keeping them out who don't want us to weaponize, right? So they don't want internationally someone who wants us to weaponize to have a link with us.
That is always there, no? In a sense, like there's economic competition. So if you're the Prime Minister of Canada, someone in charge of the economics from the nuclear people, they'll come and tell you, listen, we need to sell this, we need to make money. Your economics advisors will tell you, yes, that's a good idea because, well, the security people might tell you whatever. Your political advisors will tell you, if you don't sell the reactor, they'll buy it from someone else. So it's not like you have done some great moral thing by denying them. You just lost out on a good deal. If you buy the reactor from someone else, he'll be a closer ally to that guy because it's a pretty sensitive area to have relations in. And as Pankaj pointed out, if it is a country which is not so careful or not so concerned about proliferation like the French, for example, at least in this period, this could have international ramifications. In fact, the US would have, I think, given the choice, I'm not sure if I read this or if this is my assumption, I've written this in my dissertation, the US would have preferred that India buy the reactor from Canada than from France in that period. Because they said, hey, we can control Canada, we can tell Canada don't sell the fuel and they will not sell. But France these days, they don't listen to us. So, there are a lot of factors in this, which that Yuan Brett has that book, Politics of Can-Do Exports, where where the author explains that very clearly all these different strands in one decision.
So is it safe to assume that what's happening in Kulam right now, especially the Indo-Russian time, is something related to the 30-40 year business?
No.
See, the deal was finalized in 1987-89 kind of period, and the original plan was we'll give you 2 and we'll hold the option for expansion up to 8 units. I don't know if it will expand because of other issues right now, but any reactor will generate to sales for 40. If you refurbish the reactor, you will maybe push it to 60, but at best not more than 60 right now at least. So, but anyway, let's get into the